A man approached a pregnant bear to save her life. Then something unbelievable happened. The morning sun cast long shadows across the American Southwest as Kodiak stood on his hind legs, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale desert sky. At 2.1 meters tall and weighing nearly 300 kilograms, he was an imposing figure, but his deep brown eyes held a weariness that spoke of countless days searching for sustenance in an increasingly barren landscape. The drought had stretched on for months now, transforming what had once been fertile hills and verdant valleys into a wasteland of cracked earth and withered vegetation. Behind him, Aurora moved with the careful, deliberate steps of a pregnant female. Her once glossy black coat was now dulled by dust and malnutrition. She was smaller than Kodiak but no less determined, her maternal instincts driving her forward despite the growing weight in her belly and the exhaustion that seemed to seep deeper into her bones with each passing day. The pair had been together for 3 years now, an unusual arrangement for black bears, whose males typically wandered alone after mating season. But Kodiak was not a typical bear. The accident that had changed his life occurred 2 years earlier when he had attempted to cross a busy highway during his usual territorial patrol. A truck had struck him with tremendous force, sending his massive body tumbling across the asphalt like a rag doll. For days, he had lain semi-conscious in a roadside ditch, his skull fractured and his brain swollen. When he finally recovered enough to move, something fundamental had shifted within him. The injury had altered the neural pathways that governed his instincts, dampening his drive to roam and compete while amplifying his attachment to family. Where once he might have left Aurora to fend for herself after ensuring she was pregnant, now he felt an overwhelming compulsion to stay, to protect, to provide. At 15 years old, he was entering middle age for a black bear, and the combination of his injury and advancing years had transformed him from a solitary wanderer into a devoted partner and soon-to-be father. The change puzzled him sometimes, creating an internal conflict between his old instincts and new compulsions. But when he looked at Aurora, all confusion melted away into fierce protectiveness. The decision to leave their ancestral territory had not come easily. For generations, Kodiak's family had roamed these hills, following ancient paths between seasonal feeding grounds, denning in caves that had sheltered countless generations of bears before them. But the drought had made staying impossible. The streams that had once provided fresh water and attracted prey had dried to dust. The berry bushes that should have been heavy with fruit stood bare and brittle. Even the insects that formed a crucial part of their diet had largely disappeared, leaving behind only the hardiest species that offered little nutrition. Aurora's pregnancy made the situation even more desperate. She needed additional calories to support the growing cubs in her womb, but instead, she was slowly starving. Kodiak could see it in the way her ribs had begun to show through her coat, in the listless way she moved, in the hollow look that sometimes crept into her eyes when she thought he wasn't watching. The choice was simple: leave or watch his family die. Their migration began on a moonless night in late summer when the desert air finally cooled enough to make travel bearable. Kodiak led the way, his extraordinary sense of smell mapping the terrain ahead, detecting the faintest traces of water, the presence of other predators, and most importantly, the dangerous scent of human habitation. His nose, evolved over millions of years to detect food sources and threats across vast distances, could distinguish between thousands of different odors with a precision that would have seemed supernatural to human observers. The first challenge came within hours of their departure. A 4-lane highway stretched across their path, its asphalt still radiating heat from the day's sun. Kodiak's memories of his accident made him cautious, but they had no choice but to cross. He spent nearly an hour studying the traffic patterns, learning the rhythm of the vehicles that thundered past with their blinding headlights and deafening engines. When a long gap finally appeared between cars, he led Aurora across at a dead run, their paws barely touching the hot pavement before they reached the safety of the far shoulder. Night after night, they traveled through increasingly desolate country. They skirted the edges of small towns, their lights twinkling like fallen stars in the darkness. The scent of human food was tantalizingly close but too dangerous to investigate. Kodiak's altered instincts made him more cautious than most bears around humans, perhaps because his injury had left him with a deeper understanding of their capacity for both harm and occasionally help. They moved like shadows through the landscape, following dry creek beds and abandoned railroad tracks, always seeking the path of least resistance and greatest concealment. Aurora's condition made their progress slower than Kodiak would have preferred, but he matched his pace to hers, never showing impatience or frustration. When she needed to rest, he would scout ahead, always returning to her side before she could begin to worry about his absence. The journey tested them in ways they had never experienced. They went days without substantial food, surviving on insects, roots, and the occasional small rodent that Kodiak could catch. Water was even scarcer, forcing them to drink from irrigation ditches and livestock tanks, always alert for the farmers and ranchers who might not appreciate their presence. Aurora's pregnancy made her more vulnerable to dehydration, and Kodiak often gave her the larger share of whatever water they found, even when his own thirst was overwhelming. As the weeks passed, they encountered other displaced wildlife. Deer moved in larger herds than usual, their traditional territories also affected by the drought. Coyotes had become bolder, more desperate, sometimes following the bears at a distance in hopes of scavenging whatever food they might leave behind. Even the birds seemed different, their usual migration patterns disrupted by the changing climate and lack of water sources. The landscape began to change as they traveled north. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills and then to the first hints of mountains in the distance. The air grew cooler at night, and occasionally they would catch the scent of pine trees on the wind, a promise of the forest environment that both bears instinctively craved. Aurora's spirits seemed to lift as they climbed higher, her steps becoming more purposeful despite her increasing size. It was during their 7th week of travel that they first smelled the water. Not the stagnant, algae-covered pools they had been finding, but the clean, fresh scent of a running stream. Kodiak's nose led them through a narrow canyon, following the strengthening aroma of vegetation and moisture. When they finally emerged from the rocky passage, both bears stopped in amazement. Before them stretched a valley that seemed to have been untouched by the drought that had devastated their homeland. A crystal-clear stream wound through meadows of green grass, while groves of birch and aspen trees provided shade and shelter. The air was filled with the sounds of running water and bird song, a symphony they had almost forgotten existed. Most importantly, Kodiak's sensitive nose detected no scent of competing male bears, no territorial markers that would make this paradise unavailable to them. This was Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary, though the bears had no way of knowing its name or purpose. To them, it was simply the answer to their prayers, a place where Aurora could safely give birth and raise their cubs, where food and water would be abundant, where they could finally rest after their long journey. As they descended into the valley, both bears felt a sense of homecoming that neither had experienced before, as if they had been searching for this place their entire lives. The sanctuary encompassed over 2,000 acres of carefully maintained habitat, funded by private donations and managed by a small but dedicated staff. It had been established 15 years earlier as a refuge for injured and displaced wildlife, a place where animals could recover from trauma or simply live out their lives in peace. The human presence was minimal and carefully managed, designed to provide necessary care while allowing the animals to behave as naturally as possible. Kodiak and Aurora spent their first days in the sanctuary exploring cautiously, learning the lay of the land, and establishing their own territory within the larger ecosystem. The abundance of food was almost overwhelming after months of near starvation. Berry bushes heavy with fruit grew along the stream banks, while the meadows provided roots and grasses that Aurora craved during her pregnancy. Fish swam in the clear water, and the forest floor was rich with insects and small mammals. But it was not just the abundance of resources that made the sanctuary special. There was something else, something that Kodiak's altered instincts allowed him to perceive more clearly than most wild animals. The human presence here was different from what they had encountered during their journey. There was no aggression, no threat, no desire to harm or exploit. Instead, there was a quality that Kodiak could only interpret as sadness mixed with love, a combination that his injury-altered brain found oddly comforting. Samuel Sam Whitehorse had been the head caretaker of Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary for 3 decades, and every line on his weathered face told the story of those years. At 60, he moved with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned to observe before acting, to listen before speaking, to understand the needs of creatures who could not voice their pain in human words. His hands, scarred from countless encounters with frightened and injured animals, were gentle despite their strength, and his eyes held a depth of sorrow that seemed to reflect the suffering of every creature he had tried to save. The sanctuary had become his refuge after the worst day of his life, the day he received the call that his son, Michael Anderson, had been killed in Afghanistan. Michael had been 28 years old, a military veterinarian who had volunteered for deployment because he believed he could save lives, both human and animal, in a war zone. He had inherited his father's compassion for creatures in need, but unlike Sam, who had channeled his empathy into the relatively safe work of wildlife rehabilitation, Michael had chosen to carry his healing mission into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The funeral had been a blur of folded flags and military honors, but Sam remembered with crystal clarity the last conversation he had had with his son before deployment. Michael had called from the base, his voice crackling over the satellite connection, to tell his father about an injured dog he had found near the barracks. "Dad," he had said, "I want to save every life, whether human or animal. That's what you taught me, right? That every life has value and that we have a responsibility to help when we can." Those words had become both Sam's inspiration and his torment. In the years following Michael's death, he had thrown himself into his work at the sanctuary with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every animal he saved was a small victory against the randomness of death, every successful rehabilitation, a tiny act of defiance against the forces that had taken his son. But it was never enough. The grief remained, a constant companion that colored every sunrise and shadowed every accomplishment. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the sanctuary 5 years earlier, carrying her own burden of loss. At 50, she was an accomplished veterinarian who had given up a lucrative practice in Denver to work for a fraction of her former salary in the remote Wyoming wilderness. Her colleagues had thought her mad, abandoning financial security and professional prestige to tend to wild animals that would never thank her for her efforts. But Sarah had her reasons that she kept locked away in her heart like a sacred wound. Emma had been 8 years old when the leukemia took her. 8 years of laughter and curiosity and boundless love for every living creature she encountered. Sarah remembered how her daughter would rescue earthworms from the sidewalk after rainstorms, how she would cry when they passed roadkill on the highway, how she would spend hours at the zoo talking to the animals as if they could understand every word. Emma had wanted to be a veterinarian like her mother, had already begun reading Sarah's old textbooks despite being barely able to sound out the complex medical terms. The disease had been swift and merciless, resistant to every treatment that Sarah's medical knowledge could devise. She had watched helplessly as her daughter grew weaker, as the light in her eyes dimmed, and as the little girl who had once been afraid of nothing began to fear the darkness that was approaching. In the end, Emma had died in Sarah's arms, her final words a whispered promise that she would take care of all the animals in heaven while her mother took care of the ones on earth. The sanctuary had been Sarah's attempt to honor that promise, to channel her grief into something productive, something that would give meaning to her daughter's death. She had found in Sam a kindred spirit, someone who understood that sometimes the only way to heal from loss was to dedicate oneself to preventing others from experiencing the same pain. They had never spoken directly about their shared grief, but it was there in the gentle way they handled injured animals, in the long hours they spent nursing sick creatures back to health, in the tears they both shed when their efforts failed. It was Sam who first noticed the unusual tracks by the stream. Paw prints far larger than those of the sanctuary's resident black bears. The prints were accompanied by smaller ones, clearly from a female, and the pattern of their movement suggested a pair that had traveled together for some distance. Sam's experienced eye could read the story written in the mud: exhaustion, hunger, the careful gait of a pregnant female, and the protective vigilance of a devoted mate. The surveillance cameras that monitored the sanctuary's boundaries soon revealed the newcomers. Kodiak appeared first on the footage, his massive frame moving through the forest with surprising grace for an animal of his size. Even through the grainy video, his unusual behavior was apparent. Most male black bears were solitary creatures, especially during mating season, but this one stayed close to his mate, never venturing far from her side, always alert to potential threats. Aurora's pregnancy was obvious to Sarah's trained eye, her swollen belly and the careful way she moved marking her as a female in her final trimester. The veterinarian estimated that the cubs would be born within the next few weeks, and she began preparing for the possibility that the wild birth might require human intervention. She had assisted with difficult deliveries before, but always with captive animals that were accustomed to human presence. Working with truly wild bears would present challenges she had never faced. As the days passed, Sam and Sarah observed the bear pair with growing fascination. Kodiak's behavior continued to defy normal bear psychology. He was protective to an almost obsessive degree, never allowing Aurora to venture far from his sight, always positioning himself between her and any potential threat. His senses seemed hyperacute, his head constantly turning to track sounds and scents that were imperceptible to human observers. There was something almost human in his devotion, a quality that reminded both Sam and Sarah of their own experiences with love and loss. Aurora, for her part, seemed to trust her mate completely. She would feed while he stood guard, rest while he patrolled their territory, and move when he indicated it was time to relocate. The partnership between them was seamless, born of mutual dependence and deepened by shared hardship. Sarah found herself thinking of her own marriage, which had not survived the stress of Emma's illness and death. Her ex-husband had grieved differently, pulling away when she needed him most, unable to bear the constant reminder of what they had lost. Watching the bears' devotion to each other filled her with both admiration and a deep sense of longing. The sanctuary's other residents seemed to sense that something significant was happening. The deer that usually grazed near the stream moved to different areas, instinctively giving the bears a wide berth. The smaller predators, foxes and coyotes, adjusted their hunting patterns to avoid potential conflicts. Even the birds seemed more alert, their calls carrying news of the newcomers throughout the forest network. Aurora chose her birthing den with the same careful consideration that had marked the pair's entire journey. She selected a small cave on the mountainside, partially hidden by a screen of pine branches, and positioned to provide both shelter and multiple escape routes. The location was perfect from a bear's perspective, elevated enough to avoid flooding, secluded enough to provide privacy, but accessible enough to allow for quick departure if necessary. Kodiak established a 50-meter perimeter around the den, marking the boundaries with his scent and patrolling constantly. His vigilance was so intense that Sam and Sarah could barely approach within 100 meters without triggering his alarm response. The big bear's protective instincts had reached a fever pitch, and any intrusion into his territory was met with immediate and overwhelming aggression. The sanctuary's environment seemed to have a calming effect on both bears. The abundance of food allowed Aurora to gain weight during her final weeks of pregnancy, while the lack of competing males meant that Kodiak could focus entirely on his mate's needs rather than defending territory. For the first time in their lives, they experienced something approaching peace, a respite from the constant struggle for survival that defined existence in the wild. But peace, as both Sam and Sarah knew from bitter experience, was often fragile and temporary. When Aurora went into labor on a cold October morning, what should have been a natural process quickly became a life-threatening emergency. The contractions that began at dawn continued throughout the day without producing any cubs, and by evening, it was clear that something was seriously wrong. Sarah's veterinary training allowed her to diagnose the problem from a distance, using binoculars to observe Aurora's condition. The bear was suffering from uterine inertia, a condition where the muscles of the uterus become too exhausted to contract effectively. Without intervention, both mother and cubs would die within hours. The treatment was relatively simple, an injection of oxytocin to stimulate contractions. But administering it would require getting close enough to touch Aurora, a task that seemed impossible with Kodiak standing guard. The first attempt came at sunset when Sam and Sarah approached the den with medical supplies and tranquilizer equipment. They made it to within 60 meters before Kodiak detected their presence. The massive bear rose to his full height, his roar echoing across the valley like thunder, and charged toward them with terrifying speed. He stopped just short of actual contact, but his message was clear: approach at your own peril. The second attempt, made under cover of darkness, was even less successful. Kodiak's extraordinary sense of smell detected them from 70 meters away, and this time he didn't bother with warnings. He ran straight at them, his massive form materializing out of the darkness like a nightmare, stopping just 5 meters away with his claws extended and his teeth bared. The threat was unmistakable, and both humans retreated quickly, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. By the third attempt, made near midnight, Aurora had been in labor for nearly 18 hours. Sarah could see through the night vision scope that the bear was weakening rapidly, her breathing shallow and her movements increasingly sluggish. Time was running out, and conventional approaches were clearly not working. They needed a different strategy, something that would allow them to reach Aurora without triggering Kodiak's protective rage. It was then that Sam made a decision that would change all their lives. Instead of approaching with stealth or force, he chose vulnerability. At 3 a.m, with Aurora barely conscious and Kodiak pacing frantically outside the den, Sam walked directly toward the protective father, making no attempt to hide his presence or his intentions. When Kodiak reared up to his full height, his massive form silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Sam did something that defied every instinct for self-preservation. He knelt. The words that poured from Sam's lips came from the deepest part of his soul, the place where his grief for Michael lived like a constant flame. "My son," he sobbed, his voice breaking with emotion. "Michael died because I couldn't save him. I failed my own child. Please don't let your mate and cubs die the same way. I know the pain you're feeling, the helplessness, the fear. Please let us help." Kodiak's roar died in his throat, replaced by a silence so profound that the only sound was the whisper of wind through the pine trees. His deep brown eyes, filled with intelligence and pain, studied the kneeling human with an intensity that seemed to penetrate to Sam's very soul. Something in the bear's expression shifted, a recognition that transcended species boundaries and spoke to the universal experience of love and loss. Sarah stepped forward, her own grief giving her courage. She knelt beside Sam, her voice trembling as she spoke. "My daughter Emma was 8 years old when she died. Leukemia. I'm a doctor and I still couldn't save my own child. We understand your pain because we've lived it. We know what it means to lose everything that matters." The two humans knelt in the darkness, their tears falling onto the forest floor, their grief laid bare before a wild animal who had every reason to see them as enemies. But Kodiak's senses, evolved over millions of years to detect truth from deception, told him something extraordinary. The chemical signature of their emotions was unmistakable, not fear or aggression, but genuine sorrow, the same pheromones of grief that he had been carrying since Aurora's labor began. For 30 seconds that felt like eternity, bear and humans regarded each other in perfect silence. Then slowly, Kodiak stepped back 3 paces. He remained alert, ready to attack if necessary, but his posture had changed from aggressive to merely protective. The message was clear: approach, but know that I am watching. Sam and Sarah moved forward with infinite care, each step deliberate and non-threatening. Kodiak shadowed them from 2 meters behind, his massive presence a constant reminder of how quickly the situation could turn deadly. When Sarah knelt beside Aurora to check her pulse, the exhausted bear opened her eyes and looked directly at the human woman. There was no fear in that gaze, only a desperate plea for help that transcended the boundaries between species. The oxytocin injection took only seconds to administer, but the 45 minutes that followed were the longest of everyone's lives. Kodiak sat like a statue, his eyes never leaving the humans who were working to save his mate. Sarah monitored Aurora's vital signs while Sam kept watch, all of them united in their desperate hope that the intervention would work. When the contractions finally began in earnest, Aurora's eyes filled with renewed strength. The first cub, a male that would later be named River, emerged after 20 minutes of intense labor. The second, a female they would call Sky, followed 10 minutes later. Both cubs were healthy and vigorous, their cries filling the night air with the sound of new life. Kodiak's reaction was immediate and profound. He approached Sam slowly, his massive paw coming to rest on the man's shoulder in a gesture that was unmistakably one of gratitude. Then, in a moment that would remain etched in Sam's memory forever, the great bear pressed his forehead against the human's. The sacred gesture of acknowledgement and respect that bears reserve for their own kind. Aurora, exhausted but triumphant, extended her muzzle towards Sarah's hand. The gentle touch was her own expression of thanks, a recognition of the debt she owed to the human who had saved her life and the lives of her cubs. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the unlikely group sat together in the aftermath of their shared miracle, forever changed by the experience of crossing the boundaries between species to save a life. The months that followed were a time of healing and growth for all involved. River and Sky thrived under their parents' care, growing from helpless cubs into playful youngsters who showed no fear of the humans who had helped bring them into the world. Sam and Sarah found that their own grief had been transformed by the experience, not eliminated, but given new meaning and purpose. On the anniversary of Michael's death, Sam sat beside his son's grave in the small cemetery near the sanctuary. The headstone bore the inscription that had become Sam's guiding principle: he wanted to save every life, whether human or animal. As Sam sat in quiet contemplation, remembering his son's voice and the dreams they had shared, he became aware of movement in the trees behind him. Kodiak emerged first, his massive form moving with the quiet dignity that had characterized him since that night in the den. Aurora followed, with River and Sky close behind, now nearly full-grown themselves. The bear family approached the grave site with what could only be described as reverence, their behavior suggesting an understanding that this was a sacred place. Kodiak placed his paw on Michael's headstone, the gesture so deliberate and meaningful that Sam felt his breath catch in his throat. Aurora gently nudged her cubs forward as if introducing them to someone important, someone who had played a role in their survival even though they had never met him. The symbolism was overwhelming. The family that had been saved was paying their respects to the son who had inspired their salvation. Sarah appeared at Sam's side, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort and understanding. The veterinarian had become more than just a colleague in the years since that night. She had become a partner in both work and life, someone who understood the healing power of dedicating oneself to saving others. They had found in each other what they had lost in their children: a sense of purpose, a reason to continue, a way to transform grief into something beautiful and meaningful. The Michael Anderson Memorial Fund was established that same year, dedicated to protecting black bears and other endangered species throughout the American West. The fund's mission statement, written jointly by Sam and Sarah, reflected their shared understanding that saving wildlife was not just about conservation. It was about honoring the memory of those who had believed in the value of every life. Their wedding was a simple affair held beside the stream where they had first observed Kodiak and Aurora together. The bear family attended as honored guests, their presence a testament to the bonds that had formed between species. River and Sky, now adults themselves, had begun to show signs of the same unusual devotion to family that characterized their father, suggesting that Kodiak's altered instincts might be passed on to future generations. Years passed, and the sanctuary became a model for wildlife rehabilitation programs across the country. Sam and Sarah's work attracted attention from researchers and conservationists, but they remained focused on their primary mission: providing a safe haven for creatures that had nowhere else to turn. The bear family remained central to their lives, returning regularly to the place where they had found safety and acceptance. As Sam entered his 65th year, he often reflected on the strange turns that life had taken. The loss of Michael had nearly destroyed him, but that same loss had ultimately led him to a deeper understanding of love and sacrifice. The bears had taught him that grief was not something to be overcome, but something to be transformed, channeled into action that honored those who had been lost. On a golden autumn afternoon, as Sam sat reading beside his cabin, he was visited by 3 generations of bears. Kodiak and Aurora, now elderly but still devoted to each other, led the procession. River and Sky followed with their own mates and cubs, a thriving dynasty that had grown from that desperate night when life and death had hung in the balance. One particularly curious cub, a third-generation descendant of the original pair, approached Sam with a fearless confidence that only comes from a lifetime of safety and acceptance. The little bear touched Sam's hand with its paw, a gesture of trust that represented everything the sanctuary had achieved. This was what Michael had dreamed of, a world where different species could coexist in harmony, where fear and aggression gave way to understanding and mutual respect. Kodiak, though slowed by age, still maintained his role as the family patriarch. His eyes, now clouded with cataracts but still filled with intelligence and affection, found Sam's face across the clearing. The recognition was immediate and profound, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them in the darkest hour of their lives. Aurora approached and rested her grizzled muzzle on Sam's knee, her breathing slow and peaceful. The gesture was both greeting and farewell, a recognition that their time together was finite but precious. Sarah joined them, her own hair now silver, but her eyes still bright with purpose and love. "You know," Sam said to his wife, watching as the bear family settled around them in the fading light, "I once thought I'd lost everything. But it turns out love never dies. It just transforms into new forms, more beautiful ones." The sun set over Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The stream continued its eternal song, carrying with it the stories of all who had found refuge in this special place. Sam, Sarah, and 3 generations of bears sat together in comfortable silence, united by the understanding that pain shared becomes bearable, that love given freely returns multiplied, and that the connections formed in moments of crisis can last a lifetime. In the gathering dusk, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the sanctuary held its breath. This was the magic that happened when different species chose trust over fear, when grief was transformed.